Hey guys! Tonight, we're going to take a very long walk. Or maybe a camel ride. Either way, don't worry, you don't actually have to move. Just get comfortable, dim the lights, maybe sip some tea, and let's drift into the strange, dusty, and oddly glamorous world of the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road wasn't really a single road. It wasn't even paved. And it definitely didn't have streetlights or rest stops where you could grab a coffee. Instead, it was this messy, sprawling network of trade routes that linked the East and the West for over 1,000 years. Think of it less like a highway and more like a tangled web of dirt trails, mountain passes, caravan stops, and deserts that everyone complained about but still used because, well, there was money to be made. It stretched from China through Central Asia into the Middle East, and finally, if you were lucky enough to not get robbed, lost, or swallowed by the Gobi Desert, into Europe. And if that sounds exhausting, don't worry, we're not walking it. We're just going to float lazily along like an overpriced bolt of silk being carried on the back of some poor overworked camel. So why silk? Because apparently, people in Rome couldn't resist a shiny fabric that was ridiculously impractical for their climate. Roman senators who were supposed to embody masculine austerity and gravitas were strutting around in transparent silk robes that basically looked like something you'd find in a discount lingerie shop. And of course, conservative moralists absolutely hated it. One Roman historian even complained that silk was depleting the treasury and corrupting morals, which, if you've ever seen Roman morals, was already a pretty low bar. But silk wasn't the only thing traded. Spices, glassware, paper, precious metals, and sometimes even diseases were carried along the route. Yes, the Black Death hitched a ride down this highway of doom too. So thanks, global trade. Let's float back to the beginning. The Silk Road really started to take shape during the Han Dynasty in China around the 2nd century BCE. The Han emperors were busy expanding westward, trying to secure allies against their annoying northern neighbors, the Jingnu, basically horse-riding steppe nomads who were making life miserable for Chinese farmers. The Chinese court thought, maybe we can make friends with other horse-riding people farther west, and together we'll gang up on the Jingnu. So they sent out diplomats, the most famous being a man named Zhang Qian. Now, Zhang Qian's job description was basically wander off into dangerous unknown lands, try not to die, and see if you can make friends. Spoiler, he did die, eventually, but only after a very long and miserable career of being kidnapped, imprisoned, and wandering deserts. But here's the thing. His reports back to the Han court opened Chinese eyes to a whole new world. He came back babbling about kingdoms in Central Asia that had great horses, tall people, and strange goods. And the Han emperors thought, well, we don't really like these Westerners, but we do like their stuff. Let's trade. And just like that, the Silk Road became a thing. Now, if you're picturing a nice, clean road with wayfinding signs, don't. This was more like a dusty patchwork of paths that caravans of camels, donkeys, and occasionally very grumpy merchants had to stumble through. There were deserts that stretched for days without water, mountains that wanted to kill you with avalanches, and bandits lurking at every pass. Yet somehow it worked, because money talks louder than the sound of howling desert winds. Chinese silk made its way to Persia, India, and eventually Rome. Meanwhile, the Chinese got glassware, horses, and, very importantly, grapes. Yes, wine was a Silk Road import. The Han court loved it so much they started planting vineyards. Imagine that! China 2,000 years ago, trying out their first winery because of some tipsy diplomat who stumbled in from Central Asia. And speaking of horses, the Chinese obsession with horses was real. They weren't impressed with their local stock, which they found weak and short. But when they saw the tall, muscular, heavenly horses, basically the Ferrari stallions as the ancient world, they wanted them badly. There's even a story about the Han Dynasty going to war just to secure horse trading rights. Imagine fighting an entire campaign because you really, really wanted a better ride. These horses became prestige symbols, painted on tomb walls and celebrated in poems. Meanwhile, the poor actual horses probably had no idea they were status symbols. They just wanted hay. Let's float further west. While China was cranking out silk, spices from India were making their way east and west too. Pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were basically the luxury perfumes of ancient kitchens. Roman nobles loved to dump absurd amounts of spice into their food just to prove how rich they were. Picture a Roman senator choking on an over-peppered chicken leg while wearing see-through silk. That's the Silk Road for you. Fashion meets indigestion. Glassware from Rome also traveled east. The Chinese were fascinated by Roman glass, which they couldn't replicate at the time. So, while Romans were marveling at paper and silk, the Chinese were staring at cups and bowls like they were magic. To be fair, some of those Roman glass cups are still beautiful today, so you can't really blame them. But of course, this wasn't just about stuff. It was about ideas, too. Religions hitched rides along the Silk Road like free passengers sneaking onto a caravan. Buddhism, for example, spread from India to China along these routes. Traders would carry statues, scrolls, and teachings, setting up monasteries in caravan towns. Before long, Buddhist art started popping up in caves across Western China, decorated with that classic, serene face but slightly bored expression. Later on, Islam, Christianity, and even Zoroastrianism would make appearances along the trade routes. So the Silk Road wasn't just an ancient Amazon Prime delivery system, it was also the first podcast network of ideas, beliefs, and worldviews. Now, here's the thing. The Silk Road wasn't always glamorous. It was slow, painfully slow. Imagine taking months, sometimes years, to move goods from one side to the other. Caravans had to stop constantly, rest, trade hands, and deal with taxes and tolls at every border. Every local ruler wanted a cut. Merchants probably spent more time arguing with customs officers than actually walking. Some things never change. And then there was the weather. The Gobi Desert could fry you by day and freeze you by night. The Taklamakan Desert's name literally means go in and you won't come out, which is just the kind of name you don't want on your travel brochure. Yet traders still risked it, because silk and spices paid very, very well. As centuries rolled on, empires rose and fell, but the Silk Road kept going. Sometimes more active, sometimes less, depending on whether Mongols were rampaging or Persians were busy collecting taxes. Ah, yes, the Mongols. We'll get to them later. For now, just know that when Genghis Khan's descendants controlled basically the entire central stretch of the Silk Road, trade actually got a lot more safe. Because when the Mongols weren't burning cities, they were surprisingly good at protecting merchants. It was kind of their way of saying, yes, we'll kill you, but only if you don't pay the toll. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, just imagine the early centuries of the Silk Road, dusty caravans, anxious merchants, suspicious innkeepers, and silk bolts being passed from hand to hand like very fragile and very expensive hot potatoes. And remember, most of the people buying silk in Rome had no idea where it came from. To them, it was just this exotic, mysterious cloth from the East. Some even believed silk grew on trees, which
is not entirely wrong since it does come from silkworms munching on mulberry leaves, but no, Romans, you can't just plant a silk tree and wait for lingerie to grow. Sorry. And that, my sleepy travelers, is the beginning of the Silk Road. A road that wasn't a road, carrying things that weren't always practical to people who usually misunderstood them, but somehow it stitched together a world that was bigger and stranger than anyone could imagine. Now, let's slowly drift into the next stretch of history where we'll see how medieval Europe, the Islamic caliphates, and a few very cranky emperors got tangled up in this dusty, endless web of trade.
Welcome back, my drowsy travelers. I hope your pillows are fluffed, your blanket fortress is properly constructed, and you've made peace with the fact that, yes, we're still in the desert. Because tonight, our journey drifts into the medieval era, the so-called golden age of the Silk Road. Spoiler, it was only golden if you were collecting taxes. So, remember how the early Silk Road was this tangled web of merchants bumping along dusty tracks? Well, by the Middle Ages, things had gotten bigger. The old Roman Empire had collapsed, but trade didn't. Instead, new powers stepped in to play the great game of who gets to squeeze the merchants for toll money this century. And the answer, more often than not, was everybody. Let's float first into the Middle East, because that region was basically the neighborhood watch of the Silk Road. After the rise of Islam in the 7th century, the Islamic caliphates controlled a huge stretch of territory, from Spain across North Africa into Persia and nudging right up against Central Asia. Which meant, if you were a Chinese merchant hoping to get your precious silk all the way to a fashion-addicted noble in Paris, chances were you'd have to pay an Arab tax collector along the way. The Abbasid Caliphate, centraled in Baghdad, especially loved this role. Baghdad wasn't just a political capital, it was a shopping mall of wonders. Imagine stalls bursting with spices, silks, carpets, gems, perfumes, and probably a guy trying to sell you a questionable camel. The caliphs themselves decorated their courts with treasures from as far away as India and China. One historian even described the caliph's palace as basically a glittering fever dream of imported luxury. And while they were at it, the Abbasids turned Baghdad into a brainy hotspot too. Thanks to Silk Road contacts, scholars were translating Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic. So while Europe was busy forgetting how to bathe, Baghdad was churning out advances in medicine, astronomy, and mathematics. Basically, the Silk Road didn't just deliver silk. It delivered algebra, which, depending on your feelings about math homework, is either a gift or a curse. Meanwhile, Europe was having what we might call a fashion problem. Medieval kings and queens loved silk just as much as their Roman predecessors, and they were willing to pay absurd prices for it. But they didn't want their subjects blowing all their money on see-through tunics, so they made laws about it. Sumptuary laws, they were called, rules about who could wear what. In theory, this meant only nobles could wear silk. In practice, merchants kept sneaking into the club anyway, because nothing says, "I've made it," like showing up to Sunday service wrapped in fabric that literally crossed deserts, mountains, and tax-hungry toll booths just to end up on your shoulders. And of course, the church had opinions. Bishops lectured that silk was too luxurious, too sensual, and too foreign, which just made people want it more. Humanity's basic rule of thumb: tell us we can't have something, and we immediately want it in 3 colors. Now, let's drift eastward again into Central Asia. This was the true beating heart of the Silk Road, a region filled with nomadic tribes, caravanserai, and towns that basically lived off the fact that merchants had to pass through. One of the most famous of these towns was Samarkand in modern Uzbekistan. If the Silk Road was a necklace, Samarkand was the shiny jewel in the middle. It was strategically placed between China, Persia, and the Middle East. merchants had no choice but to stop there, which made it a melting pot of languages, religions, and cuisines. Imagine walking through Samarkand around the 10th century. You'd hear Chinese, Persian, Arabic, maybe even a few Italians yelling about shipping delays. The markets would be overflowing with spices from India, silk from China, glass from Venice, carpets from Persia, and, naturally, counterfeit knockoffs of all the above. Because even in the Middle Ages, people were trying to pass off cheap goods as authentic imports. And because travel was slow, Samarkand and other cities along the way became little worlds of their own, halfway houses where cultures blended. You could find Buddhist monks sipping tea next to Muslim scholars debating astronomy, while Christian traders grumbled about camel prices. It wasn't exactly peaceful, but it was cosmopolitan in a way Europe wouldn't really see until much later. But of course, there was always a catch. This was the Middle Ages, which means crusades. Yes, European knights decided that what the world really needed was a few centuries of awkward holy wars. The Crusades, starting in the late 11th century, disrupted Silk Road trade in all sorts of irritating ways. Suddenly, merchants had to navigate around angry soldiers with crosses on their shields who weren't exactly known for subtle diplomacy. And yet, ironically, the Crusades also boosted trade. Because when European knights marched east to the Holy Land, they came back with a taste for Eastern luxuries. Spices, silk, sugar, and even lemons suddenly became all the rage in Europe. So, in a weird roundabout way, these bloody pilgrimages helped the Silk Road business boom. Typical Middle Ages logic: fight over Jerusalem, return home addicted to cinnamon rolls. Speaking of cinnamon, let's take a moment to appreciate just how obsessed medieval people were with spices. We think of salt and pepper as basic table stuff, but back then, spices were as good as gold. Literally, peppercorns were used as currency, stored in vaults, and demanded as rent. Imagine paying your landlord in pepper. Sounds weird, until you realize landlords today would probably accept it if the price was right. Cinnamon and cloves were considered medicinal, aphrodisiac, and exotic. They were thrown into everything from wine to stew, regardless of whether it made sense. There's even a record of medieval recipes calling for cinnamon on fried fish, which feels like a culinary crime, but hey, they were excited. So yes, spices fueled trade just as much as silk did. Merchants risked deserts, robbers, and taxes for the chance to deliver peppercorns to some duke who would brag about them at dinner. Humanity, in short, has always been ridiculous. Now, let's float gently into the 13th century, because here comes the big one, the Mongols. If you thought earlier Silk Road travel was dangerous, imagine doing it when Genghis Khan and his descendants were galloping around, conquering half the known world. At first, this sounds like a nightmare, but in reality, it was surprisingly helpful. See, once the Mongols finished torching cities and piling up skulls in their usual charming way, they settled down and realized they could make a lot of money by keeping merchants safe. This was the era of the Pax Mongolica, literally the Mongol peace. For about a century, the Mongols controlled almost the entire Silk Road, which meant fewer borders, fewer tolls, and fewer bandits willing to mess with you. Because, let's be honest, nobody wanted to rob a caravan that had Mongol protection. Under Mongol rule, trade flourished. Caravanserai, those roadside inns where traders could rest, popped up everywhere. Roads were maintained, passports, yes, actual travel documents, were issued so merchants could cross borders safely. Suddenly, goods were moving faster and safer than ever before. And this is where we get famous Silk Road travelers like Marco Polo. Ah, Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who allegedly traveled all the way to China in the late 1200s and then wrote a book about it that made him Europe's most famous travel influencer. Historians still debate whether he actually made it all the way to Kublai Khan's court or whether he just collected stories from other merchants and stitched them together like an overexcited middle-aged blogger. But either way, his book fascinated Europeans. He described the wealth of China, the greatness of Kublai Khan, the strange foods, the magnificent cities. He basically turned the East into this glittering fantasy land in the minds of Europeans, fueling centuries of daydreams about getting rich through trade. Marco also described paper money, coal, and noodles, things Europeans found weird, suspicious, or downright fake. One can imagine a Venetian merchant reading about coal and saying, "Rocks that burn? Absurd." But yes, Marco, coal is real. The Mongol Empire didn't last forever, of course. By the 14th century, it fractured, and the Silk Road became dangerous again. But for that brief shining window, the Mongols created one of the safest and busiest highways the world had ever seen. And for merchants, it was like winning the lottery. Of course, it wasn't just goods moving along the road. Ideas and diseases kept hitching rides too. And this is where we meet the uninvited guest of the 14th century. Yes, the plague that wiped out maybe half of Europe got its free ticket on Silk Road caravans. Fleas on rats traveled with merchants, probably originating somewhere in Central Asia. From there, the plague spread westward, killing millions and making...
Welcome back. You're probably getting comfortable now, maybe even nodding off a little, which is perfect because this part of the Silk Road story is all about slow decline. And nothing says bedtime history quite like a centuries-long fading out of relevance. So let's set the scene. It's the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Europe is slowly crawling out of the Middle Ages, brushing off the Black Death like, yeah, that was rough, while squinting towards something new called the Renaissance. The Islamic world is still powerful, but divided. And China, well, China is still China, rich, sophisticated, and occasionally deciding the outside world is too much trouble. And through all this, the Silk Road is still hanging on. Merchants are trudging along, caravans are creaking, camels are sighing, but the golden days are fading. Why? Because humans discovered a brand new toy, ships. Let's float gently into the 15th century, when everyone started realizing you could skip deserts and bandits entirely if you just went around them. Sea routes were not new, of course. People had been sailing in the Indian Ocean for ages. But suddenly, Europeans decided to join the party in a big way. Why? Because the Ottomans had shown up. Yes, the Ottomans, the empire that makes every medieval map suddenly look complicated. In 1453, they did something dramatic. They captured Constantinople, renamed it Istanbul, and basically said, "We own this trade choke point now, thank you very much." Europe was not thrilled. For centuries, Venetian and Genoese merchants had been funneling goods from the Silk Road through Constantinople into Europe. Now the Ottomans were charging heavy tolls, and Europe's luxury-loving nobles were cranky. Spices, silk, sugar, all suddenly more expensive. Imagine your Amazon Prime subscription doubling overnight. That's how Europe felt. So naturally, they started thinking, what if we just sailed around? Enter the age of exploration. Portuguese sailors, backed by Prince Henry the Navigator, who, by the way, never navigated anything personally, started poking their noses down the coast of Africa. Vasco da Gama eventually made it all the way to India in 1498. And just like that, Europe realized you didn't need camels when you had ships. Meanwhile, over in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella were busy sponsoring a certain Christopher Columbus, who thought he could reach Asia by sailing west. Instead, he bumped into an entirely different continent, and you probably know how that story went. But the point is, the Silk Road was no longer the only global trade network in town. Suddenly, the oceans were open highways, and compared to trudging through the Taklamakan Desert, they seemed pretty appealing. Well, except for the occasional storm or mutiny. But don't get too cozy on your imaginary ship just yet. The Silk Road didn't just disappear overnight. It limped along, still useful for regional trade, still carrying goods like jade, horses, and local textiles. But the long-distance east-to-west glamour trade, that was shifting to the seas. You can see this in how the balance of power changed. Venice, once fabulously wealthy from controlling overland trade, started losing its monopoly. Meanwhile, Lisbon, Amsterdam, and eventually London grew fat off sea trade profits. The Silk Road cities, once glittering jewels of commerce, slowly dimmed. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, names that once rang with caravan bells, fell into decline. Some became provincial backwaters, others simply crumbled. Caravanserais, once bustling with gossip and spice deals, turned into ruins haunted by stray goats. It's the historical equivalent of watching a mall die after everyone discovers online shopping. The escalators still work, technically, but nobody's there. Now, let's drift east again, because China deserves its spotlight in this decline story. In the early 15th century, under the Ming Dynasty, China actually dabbled in sea trade themselves. The most famous example, Admiral Zhang He. He was a eunuch, yes, really, who commanded massive treasure fleets that sailed as far as East Africa. His ships were so big they made Columbus's little boats look like bath toys. Zhang He's voyages brought back exotic animals like giraffes, and he basically showed the world that China could dominate the seas if it wanted to. But here's the twist. After a few decades, the Ming court said, too expensive, too much hassle, let's just stop. They literally dismantled the fleets, banned large-scale overseas trade, and went back to focusing inward. It's like China invented the most advanced shipping industry in the world, then collectively said, we're good, and ghosted the entire Indian Ocean, which, in hindsight, left the seas wide open for Europeans to swoop in. So, while caravans in Central Asia were fading, China chose not to compete at sea, a decision that historians still argue about today, usually with a tone of, well, that was a missed opportunity. And speaking of Central Asia, let's pause for a moment to picture the region in the 16th century. The once mighty Silk Road towns were caught between new empires rising, the Safavids in Persia, the Mughals in India, and later the Russians pushing from the north. Instead of being bustling hubs of trade, they became pawns in larger imperial rivalries. For ordinary people, life became harder. Trade caravans shrank, taxes didn't, and opportunities dried up. Local rulers still clung to the old dream of Silk Road wealth, but the world had moved on. It's kind of like showing up to a party after everyone's gone home. The music's off, the snacks are stale, and you're just standing there wondering why you bothered. But even in decline, the Silk Road left legacies. Let's drift gently over a few of them, shall we? First, there was culture. Even as the road slowed down, the mix of influences it had already stirred up remained. In art, in architecture, in food, you can still see traces of Silk Road blending today. Dumplings, for instance, likely spread from Central Asia into China. Rugs from Persia still carried designs influenced by steppe nomads. Even European Renaissance paintings sometimes show silks that came through the old routes. Second, there was technology. Remember paper? That made its way from China to the Islamic world to Europe along the Silk Road. Without it, Gutenberg's printing press might have had a harder time taking off. Gunpowder, too, crept westward along those same dusty paths. So even as the road faded, its earlier cargo changed the world permanently. And third, there was the simple fact that the Silk Road had proven something, that long-distance trade linking entire continents was possible. Humans could connect across vast distances, even with camels, deserts, and toll booths. The sea routes were just a faster, saltier version of the same idea. Now, let's float briefly into the personal tragedies, because you know I love a sad royal. As the Silk Road declined, many dynasties that had relied on it also crumbled. The Timurids, who once made Samarkand sparkle with mosques and observatories, fizzled out. Their descendants often ended up as pawns in larger empires, reduced from glittering conquerors to footnotes. The Safavids and Ottomans fought over scraps of trade, but even they couldn't compete with Portuguese and Dutch ships. Meanwhile, in Europe, monarchs who once posed proudly in imported silks started posing in even fancier imported brocades and velvets brought by sea, which meant, ironically, that the decline of the Silk Road just meant monarchs found new ways to bankrupt themselves on clothes. Some things never change. So if you're wondering when exactly the Silk Road ended, the answer is it didn't. It just transformed. By the 17th century, the great overland caravans were mostly a memory, but regional Silk Roads, smaller routes in Central Asia, Persia, and India, kept going. They carried tea, cotton, and opium in later centuries. They mattered locally, even if they no longer made global headlines. And in a way, the Silk Road never truly died, because the idea of it, the romance of connecting East and West, kept lingering. Poets, travelers, and eventually archaeologists kept writing about it, imagining it, and excavating it. The real decline wasn't the disappearance of a road, it was the shift of attention. Once the oceans opened, the Silk Road became yesterday's news, forgotten not because it failed, but because humans had found an easier way to chase profit. And so we drift to the end of the Silk Road story. A road that wasn't really a road, which gave the world silk, spices, and some unfortunate plagues, only to be outcompeted by ships. A network that stitched together cultures for over 1,000 years, and then quietly unraveled, leaving behind echoes in food, fashion, and forgotten ruins. The Silk Road faded, but its ghost still lingers. Every time you sip tea, eat pasta, or wear silk pajamas, you're brushing against its legacy. And maybe that's the perfect bedtime thought, that even the dustiest old road can leave threads that reach all the way into our modern lives.
Welcome back, my drowsy travelers. By now, we've wandered through deserts, climbed into Samarkand's glittering past, and then watched the Silk Road slowly wither as everyone realized ships were just easier. Tonight, we're going to float into what happened after the road had mostly faded. Its afterlife, so to speak. Because even when the camels stopped trudging, the Silk Road refused to die quietly. If history teaches us anything, it's that humans love nostalgia, and the Silk Road became one of history's greatest nostalgia projects. Forgotten for centuries, rediscovered by explorers, romanticized by poets, and of course, claimed by modern nations who really enjoy using the words Silk Road in tourism ads. So, fluff your pillow again, take a deep breath, and let's drift into the long echo of this not really a road. First, let's talk about the rediscovery. By the 18th and 19th centuries, Europe was deep into the age of exploration and colonization. The oceans were crowded with European ships hauling spices, cotton, and enslaved humans. But intellectuals in Europe were also busy digging through the ruins of old civilizations, patting themselves on the back for discovering places that had never actually gone anywhere. Central Asia in particular became a playground for explorers and archaeologists. Places like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, once thriving hubs, had become quieter provincial towns. But to European eyes, they looked exotic, mysterious, and full of stories. Travelers wrote breathless accounts about caravan routes, crumbling caravanserais, and half-forgotten Buddhist cave temples. Suddenly, the Silk Road was being remembered not as a dusty network of toll booths and bandits, but as a magical highway of cultural exchange. You know, the kind of romantic gloss we like to put on things once they're safely dead and buried. And speaking of romantic gloss, we can't skip over literature. In the 19th century, poets and novelists grabbed onto the Silk Road like kids finding a shiny toy. It became a symbol of mystery, adventure, and East meets West drama. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen, yes, same family as the Red Baron fighter pilot, was actually the guy who coined the term Silk Road, Seidenstraße, in the late 1800s. Before that, nobody called it that. Merchants just called it the way to that place with the expensive stuff. But once the name was invented, it stuck.
Suddenly, the Silk Road sounded sleek, glamorous, and ancient all at once. Writers couldn't resist. Painters, too. Imagine endless paintings of turbaned merchants, camels silhouetted against sunsets, and caravanserais glowing like fairy tale palaces. Never mind the fleas, dust, and dysentery of the real thing, nostalgia sells better than reality. Meanwhile, archaeology was having its moment. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, explorers from Britain, Germany, Russia, and Japan all raced into Central Asia to dig up whatever they could find. This was the golden age of finders-keepers archaeology, when Western museums grew fat on treasures carted away from other countries. One of the big targets was the Duan Caves in western China. Thousands of Buddhist cave temples carved into cliffs filled with ancient paintings and manuscripts. In 1900, a local monk named Wang Yuanlu stumbled upon a sealed cave packed with tens of thousands of documents. Scholars from Europe and Japan descended like vultures. Manuscripts in Sanskrit, Tibetan, Chinese, and Uyghur were hauled off to London, Paris, and Tokyo. To this day, these collections are split across the world, which is a polite way of saying stolen. China, understandably, still isn't thrilled about it. But from a historian's perspective, this archaeological looting revealed just how culturally rich the Silk Road had been. The manuscripts showed trade wasn't just about silk and spices, it was about stories, languages, and religions mixing in ways nobody had fully appreciated before. Let's float gently into the 20th century now. Even as archaeology was romanticizing the Silk Road, the modern world was stomping all over it with railroads and geopolitics. Central Asia became a chessboard for the so-called Great Game, the rivalry between the British and Russian empires. The Silk Road wasn't about trade anymore. It was about spies, soldiers, and surveyors mapping every mountain pass. For local people, this meant more foreign meddling, new borders, and eventually Soviet control over huge chunks of the old caravan routes. The once fluid web of trade was chopped into nation-states, rail zones, and no-go areas. The Silk Road became less of a real highway and more of a historical memory, tucked into textbooks and occasionally dragged out for romantic travel writing. But here's the twist. The Silk Road wouldn't stay just a memory. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, it staged a comeback, not as a real caravan route, but as a brand. China especially leaned into this. In 2013, Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, a massive infrastructure project designed to connect China to Europe, Africa, and beyond through railways, pipelines, and shipping routes. The name? A deliberate nod to the Silk Road, because nothing says, "Please let us build a highway through your country," like evoking 1,000 years of romanticized trade history. Tourism boards jumped in too. Silk Road tours are now a whole industry, guiding visitors through the ruins of caravanserais, the domes of Samarkand, and the desert caves of Dunhan. Glossy brochures promise adventure, history, and the chance to walk in the footsteps of Marco Polo. The reality usually involves long bus rides, overpriced souvenirs, and Wi-Fi that barely works. But hey, branding is everything. Now, let's not forget the legacies that quietly seeped into everyday life. Take food, for example. Dumplings likely traveled from Central Asia into China, evolving into the beloved jiaozi. Noodles, too, spread along the routes, eventually inspiring Italian pasta. So yes, the next time you're twirling spaghetti, thank some long-forgotten Silk Road cook who thought, what if we stretched this dough into strings? Tea, meanwhile, made its way westward and became a British obsession. Sugar, carried along by both land and sea, reshaped diets from India to Europe. Even ice cream has roots that trace back through Persian, Arab, and eventually European adaptations. You could argue that half of modern cuisine is one long Silk Road remix. And then there's art and religion. Buddhist statues in China bear Greco-Indian influences. Islamic geometric patterns echo Central Asian steppe designs. Even European Renaissance paintings show fabrics and pigments that wouldn't exist without Silk Road Trudy. The world, in short, still wears the fingerprints of a road that technically doesn't exist anymore. But perhaps the greatest legacy is the idea itself, the notion that the world is connected. Before the Silk Road, most people thought their little valley or kingdom was the center of everything. The Silk Road forced them to realize there were other centers, other powers, other luxuries. It was humanity's first experiment in globalization. Messy, slow, dangerous, but transformative. And we're still dealing with its echoes. Every time a container ship gets stuck in the Suez Canal and global trade panics, it's a reminder that our lives depend on threads of connection that stretch far beyond what we can see. The Silk Road was the first draft of that system, not perfect, but revolutionary for its time. Of course, history also has a sense of irony. The same road that once spread Buddhism, Islam, and algebra also spread the Black Death. Globalization giveth, globalization taketh away. Which is another way of saying the Silk Road was never just a fairy tale highway of culture. It was messy, contradictory, and often tragic. And maybe that's the most human legacy of all. So, as we drift toward the end of our story, let's picture it. A caravan winding its way through the desert, bells jingling softly on camel harnesses. The air is thick with dust, spice, and the faint smell of sweat. Somewhere, a merchant is calculating profits. Somewhere else, a monk is copying a manuscript by candlelight. And thousands of miles away, a noble is draping himself in silk, blissfully unaware of how many people suffered to get it to him. That was the Silk Road. Not a road, not really. Golden, not really. Peaceful, not really. But real enough to shape the world we live in. And maybe that's the perfect bedtime story. A reminder that history's most powerful forces are often the slow, plodding ones. The caravans that take centuries, the ideas that drift across deserts, the threads that quietly stitch together distant worlds.
Welcome back, Night Wanderer. You've stuck it out through the oases, the merchants, the Mongols, and even Marco Polo's over-enthusiastic travel diary. Now, as we slide into the last stretch, it's time to wrap the Silk Road up with a soft blanket. Not a dramatic finale, but a gentle folding together of its myths, its realities, and the reason why this, not really a road, still lingers in our imagination. So fluff your pillow one last time, take a slow breath, and let the caravan bells fade into the distance. Let's start with the myth-making. The Silk Road has always been more legend than reality. In modern minds, it's a single golden highway stretching from Xi'an in China to Rome, lined with bustling bazaars, glittering palaces, and wise old merchants trading silk for gold. It's the stuff of travel posters and glossy documentaries with dramatic drone shots. But as we've whispered all along, the truth was messier. There was no one road. There were dozens of little roads, trails, and detours. Some years they were bustling, other years they were barren. Sometimes trade flourished, sometimes it stalled for decades because of war, plague, or the fact that somebody decided to raise the tolls again. Calling it the Silk Road makes it sound organized, like the medieval version of the interstate highway system. In reality, it was more like the world's first patchy Wi-Fi network, sometimes working, sometimes not, sometimes secure, sometimes hacked by bandits. But myths are stubborn. Once Ferdinand von Richthofen slapped the name Seidenstrasse on it, the world latched on, because humans love a good story more than they love footnotes. And speaking of stories, let's consider the people left out of the myth. When we say Silk Road, we picture emperors and merchants, caravans and explorers. But the truth is, most of the actual work was done by people whose names we'll never know. The camel drivers who trudged day after day, the women who wove the silk in Chinese villages, the translators who sat in dark corners of caravansaries juggling 5 languages while everyone else haggled loudly, the slaves who were traded as commodities, their lives reduced to entries in an account book.
History tends to spotlight Marco Polo because he wrote a diary and Genghis Khan because he burned things, but the Silk Road was sustained by countless ordinary humans whose sweat, tears, and sheer endurance kept the whole rickety system alive. Without them, there would have been no silk in Rome, no spices in Venice, no porcelain on Portuguese tables. So when we talk about the Silk Road, it's worth pausing for those anonymous voices, the ones lost under the dust of the desert, forgotten by the storytellers. Now, let's slip over to the economics of it all. One of the funniest ironies of the Silk Road is that for all its fame, it wasn't that economically important in the big picture. Most ordinary people never saw silk, spices, or exotic goods. Farmers in Europe weren't suddenly rich because silk existed in Constantinople. Chinese peasants weren't sipping Italian wine at dinner. The Silk Road mainly enriched elites, emperors, kings, popes, and the handful of merchants who managed to survive the journey with their cargo intact. It was never about mass consumption. It was about luxury. In fact, a lot of what was traded wasn't even practical. Think about it. Silk, porcelain, ivory, saffron, all expensive, all status symbols. No one was shipping wheat or firewood across the Taklamakan. The Silk Road was basically history's longest-running luxury boutique, open only to those who could afford the entrance fee. And yet, despite its exclusivity, the ideas and technologies that piggybacked along the route filtered down to everyone eventually. That's the strange paradox. The road itself was elitist, but its side effects, like algebra, paper, and tea, reshaped entire societies. Of course, we also have to address the darker legacy. The Silk Road wasn't just about art, science, and dumplings. It was also about exploitation. Slavery was common. Human trafficking was as much a part of the network as silk bolts and porcelain bowls. Religious conflicts simmered along the trade routes, sometimes exploding into violence. Empires taxed, extorted, and squeezed the merchants until many barely made a profit. And then there was disease. The Black Death that decimated Europe in the 14th century, it hitched a ride along Silk Road networks, spreading from Central Asia westward. Globalization has always carried that double edge, knowledge and culture, but also germs and misery. So when people today wax poetic about the golden age of the Silk Road, it's worth remembering that it was never golden for everyone. For many, it was a struggle for survival. Now, let's pivot into the cultural afterglow. Even if the Silk Road was patchy and uneven, its cultural impact was enormous. Religions like Buddhism, Islam, Zoroastrianism, and Christianity didn't just spread, they adapted. A Buddhist temple in Western China might have statues that look suspiciously Greek, thanks to Hellenistic influence. Islamic scholars in Baghdad preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy, which had traveled east and then back west again. Languages overlapped, blended, and gave us new scripts. Artistic motifs hopped borders. Musical instruments moved from Persia to Europe. Even games like chess spread along these networks, mutating into different forms depending on where they landed. In other words, the Silk Road left behind a kind of DNA sequence, scattered across continents. You can still trace it today if you know what you're looking for. And so here we are. The Silk Road ended as a physical trade route centuries ago, but it survives as a metaphor. Politicians invoke it to sell infrastructure projects, tour guides use it to attract busloads of tourists, and historians, well, we keep talking about it because it's just too good a story to let go. Maybe that's the real Silk Road, not the dusty caravan trails, but the story itself. A story of connection, of curiosity, of humans being restless and greedy and inventive all at once. It's a bedtime story because, like all bedtime stories, it tells us something comforting, that we're all linked, that the world has always been interconnected, that the threads between us are older than we think. And yes, it's also a little boring at times,
perfect for lulling you into sleep. So, as we close this long wandering tale, let's picture one last scene. The road is quiet now, the sand has covered most of it, caravansaries are ruins, their courtyards silent except for the wind, the camels are gone, replaced by highways and container ships. But if you listen closely, maybe you can still hear it. The faint jingle of bells, the murmur of merchants, the whisper of 1,000 languages passing in the night. That's the Silk Road, a memory, a myth, a lesson, and a lullaby. And with that, dear traveler, we've reached the end. You've walked the whole route, from its bustling rise to its quiet fade. So close your eyes, drift off, and dream of silk, spices, and sleepy camels plodding towards the horizon.
Welcome back, dreamers. I know. We technically wrapped things up last time. The road faded, the myths lingered, the camels wandered off stage. But like any good bedtime story, sometimes you just need one more chapter before you can drift off completely. So tonight, let's take a quieter route. Not the main highway of empires and explorers, but the little side trails, the echoes, the side characters, the almost forgotten details that keep the Silk Road humming softly in the background of history. This isn't the bustling marketplace of Samarkand or the dramatic fall of Constantinople. No, this is the whispery after-hours version, the post-credit scene of the Silk Road saga. So settle in. The lights are already dim. The caravan is gone. But there are still a few footprints in the sand worth tracing. Let's start with the animals. We've spent so much time talking about merchants and emperors that we almost forgot the true heroes of the Silk Road, camels. Specifically, the Bactrian camel, with its two big humps. These shaggy, ill-tempered beasts were the trucks of their time. Without them, there would be no Silk Road. They could carry hundreds of pounds across deserts where horses would simply collapse. They could go days without water, chewing on thorn bushes like it was a 5-star meal. And yes, they spat at their handlers because if you were forced to walk 20 miles a day in 110-degree heat carrying someone's luxury fabric stash, you'd be cranky too. But camels weren't the only animals involved. Horses, particularly prized from Central Asia, became another staple of Silk Road trade. China valued them so much, they basically traded bolts of silk for entire herds. War horses were considered so essential that some dynasties nearly bankrupted themselves buying them. So yes, silk wasn't just going west, sometimes it was galloping back east in the form of horseflesh. And then there were elephants, mules, oxen, even falcons for hunting. A whole traveling zoo of creatures trudged along those trails, mostly unappreciated in the glossy legends. Now let's drift to the small luxuries. We think of silk, spices, and porcelain, but the Silk Road carried smaller, stranger items too. Coral from the Mediterranean made its way east. Exotic birds were traded westward, their feathers adorning crowns and cloaks. Precious stones, shells, amber, all little tokens of wealth that crossed deserts like stowaways. And then there was paper. It seems boring compared to silk, but paper may have been the Silk Road's most revolutionary export. After Chinese papermakers were captured in a battle in the 8th century, the knowledge spread west, changing how people wrote, stored, and shared information. Without paper, there would be no printing revolution centuries later, which means, indirectly, you owe your paperback novels and your IKEA instruction manuals to the Silk Road. Now, let's float over to medicine. Alongside luxury goods, medical knowledge traveled too. Herbs, spices, and remedies moved in both directions. Chinese medicine absorbed ideas from India and Persia. Greek and Roman medicine incorporated techniques from the East. Sometimes these treatments actually worked. Other times, not so much. For example, rhubarb was carried westward as a medicinal plant, long before anyone thought to turn it into pie. Meanwhile, opium made its way into new markets, proving that humanity has always been creative when it comes to finding new vices. Even plague remedies traveled, ironically alongside the plague itself. Merchants sold charms, amulets, and bizarre medical concoctions to protect against disease. Spoiler, they didn't. Now, let's wander into the gossip corner. The Silk Road wasn't just about objects, it was about stories. Merchants carried gossip the way we carry memes. A tale that started in Persia might end up in India, twisted and retold like an ancient game of telephone. Legends of distant lands, strange animals, and mythical monsters circulated widely. That's why medieval European maps are filled with creatures like griffins and dog-headed men. Someone on the Silk Road heard a garbled description of baboons, passed it on, and by the time it reached Paris, it had turned into a monstrous half-lion bird guarding piles of gold. Marco Polo himself is partly to blame. His stories, full of exaggerations and embellishments, blurred reality with fantasy. But he wasn't alone. The Silk Road was basically the world's earliest rumor mill. And while we're in the mood for side characters, let's pause for the religious pilgrims. Merchants weren't the only ones walking the trails. Pilgrims, monks, and scholars shuffled along too, often in worse sandals and with fewer supplies. Buddhist monks carried scriptures and relics from India into China, helping establish monasteries along the route. Muslim scholars and traders spread Islam deep into Central Asia. Christian missionaries took their chances too, though usually with less success. For every wealthy merchant, there were also barefoot devotees trudging across deserts in pursuit of spiritual enlightenment, or at least a decent shrine. Their quiet footsteps are part of the Silk Road story, though they rarely make it into the postcards. Now, let's also give a sleepy nod to the architecture. The Silk Road left behind not just objects, but buildings. Caravanserais, those roadside inns we've mentioned, dotted the landscape. Some were simple mud brick courtyards, others were massive fortified complexes with towers, stables, and prayer rooms. They were the medieval equivalent of truck stops, half shelter, half gossip hub. Imagine a courtyard filled with camels chewing loudly, merchants arguing in 5 different languages, and a cook stirring a pot of questionable stew. That was the heartbeat of the Silk Road. Some of these caravanserais survive as ruins, quiet and crumbling in the desert. Others have been restored into tourist attractions, complete with souvenir stands selling, ironically, cheap silk scarves made in factories. Now, since we've made it this far, let's peek at the languages. The Silk Road was a Tower of Babel on the move. Traders spoke Persian, Sogdian, Arabic, Chinese, Turkic, dialects, Sanskrit, Greek, you name it. Translators were essential, and entire professions sprang up around them. Sometimes this produced beautiful cultural blends. Other times, it produced hilarious misunderstandings. Documents survive showing contracts scribbled in multiple scripts, as if everyone involved said, "Fine, I'll write my part in my language, you figure it out later." Language barriers slowed trade, but they also pushed people to learn, borrow, and adapt, which is probably why so many words in our modern vocabularies have Silk Road origins, like sugar, lemon, satin, and yes, even orange. At this point, the caravan is fading into the horizon, so let's close with the idea of memory. The Silk Road is gone. The camels, the merchants, the bustling bazaars, they're all just dust now, but the memory clings. Not because it was the most efficient trade route or even the most profitable, but because it symbolized something bigger. It was humanity's first great experiment in being connected. It showed that curiosity could carry people across deserts, that greed could overcome mountains, that ideas could hop borders even when empires tried to stop them. The Silk Road was messy, inconvenient, and often dangerous, but it whispered something we still believe today, that the world is linked, and we're part of something larger than our own little valley. And that, perhaps, is why we're still telling bedtime stories about it, centuries later.
Welcome back, traveler. You've followed the camels, you've endured the dust storms, and somehow you're still awake. Or maybe you're not. Maybe this is all drifting into your subconscious as a dream about merchants arguing over spices. Either way, here we are again, on another leg of the Silk Road. This time, though, we're not sticking to the main drag. We've already covered the big stories. The emperors, the merchants, the plagues, the Marco Polos. Tonight, we're taking the back roads, the forgotten trails, the leftovers, the little footnotes that don't usually make it into grand histories, but which give the Silk Road its strangely human texture. So tuck yourself in, because this is the sleepy epilogue of an epilogue. Let's start with fashion. Yes, silk was the headline act, but the Silk Road was a runway long before Paris Fashion Week. Luxurious textiles moved in every direction: Chinese silk, Indian cotton, Persian brocades, Central Asian felt. Clothes became living billboards for global trade. A nobleman in Byzantium might strut around in robes woven in China, dyed with Persian techniques, and trimmed with fur from Siberia. Meanwhile, a merchant in Kashgar might wear boots with leather imported from the steppes and embroideries stitched in India. Fashion was status. The more exotic your outfit, the more you announced, "Look at me, I can afford the long-haul shipping costs." Nothing changes, really. Today, we still brag by wearing brand names sewn in one country, designed in another, and sold online from a third. The Silk Road was just the early version of your overcomplicated clothing tag. Next, let's drift into entertainment. Musical instruments were frequent travelers along the routes. The lute, beloved across medieval Europe, probably evolved from instruments that came through the Middle East via Central Asia. The rebab, the oud, the sitar, they all hopped along the caravan trails. Even drums and flutes made their way from one region to another, blending into local traditions. The result was a slow-motion cultural jam session. Songs picked up new rhythms, instruments sprouted extra strings. By the time a melody traveled a few thousand miles, it barely resembled its original version. Storytelling worked the same way. Fables, folk tales, and epics rode in saddlebags across deserts. The Indian Panchatantra influenced Persian tales, which in turn filtered into Arabic collections like 1001 Nights. Some of those stories even ended up in medieval Europe, reshaped again into moral fables for children. The Silk Road wasn't just about goods, it was about imagination hitching a ride. And speaking of imagination, let's pause for monsters. Because what's a good bedtime story without a few? Travelers on the Silk Road loved to exaggerate what they saw, or what they thought they saw. Tales spread of giant birds that could lift elephants, probably inspired by actual large birds, though not that large. Others spoke of lands with headless men whose faces grew from their chests. Griffins, unicorns, dog-headed tribes, you name it, someone claimed to have spotted it in Central Asia. Part of this was misunderstanding. Someone describes a rhinoceros badly, and suddenly Europe thinks there's a dragon wandering India. But part of it was also entertainment. Merchants knew a wild story could spice up their return trip. Nobody wanted to hear, "Yup, the desert was hot again." But tell them you saw a mountain of magnets so strong it ripped nails out of ships. Now that's a story worth retelling. So, thanks to the Silk Road, monsters had just as much mobility as silk and spices. Now, let's wander into food again. Because honestly, what's more comforting at bedtime than thinking about snacks? We've already talked about noodles and dumplings, but let's expand the menu. Grapes and winemaking spread from the Mediterranean eastward. Pomegranates and peaches moved westward. Pistachios, almonds, and apricots hopped along the caravan trails too. Even sugarcane, once confined to India, journeyed along these networks, eventually reaching Europe and changing diets forever. Imagine medieval Europeans tasting sugar for the first time, probably both delighted and slightly horrified at how addictive it was. Even spices had their own adventures. Cinnamon, black pepper, cloves, all traveled slowly across deserts, making their way into kitchens far from their origins. Food historians like to remind us that the medieval taste palette we imagine was heavily shaped by what trickled in from these long, winding routes. In short, if you like fruit, nuts, wine, or candy, you can thank the Silk Road. Now, let's pause for the cities. We've mentioned Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, the glittering stars of the Silk Road, but there were countless smaller way stations, towns that blossomed because they happened to sit at a crossroads, places that grew rich, then faded when the routes shifted. Some became ghost towns, their bazaars empty, their caravanserais collapsing into dust. Others reinvented themselves, surviving as local trade hubs long after the international caravans stopped. It's easy to romanticize these cities as exotic jewels, but the reality was noisier and grittier. Merchants arguing over prices, pickpockets working the crowds, market stalls selling both luxury goods and very bad street food. Think less romantic painting and more medieval strip mall with occasional outbreaks of plague. Still, for centuries, these cities were the beating heart of global exchange, and today their ruins whisper of a time when the world's treasures passed through their gates. Let's also not forget the weather, because if there's one thing that really defined the Silk Road, it wasn't silk or spices. It was the sheer unpredictability of nature. Sandstorms that swallowed caravans whole. Freezing mountain passes where snow could trap travelers for weeks. Flash floods that wiped out bridges. Merchants weren't just battling bandits. They were battling the planet itself. Survival often came down to sheer luck. Whether the snow fell late, whether the river froze over, whether the winds pushed in your favor. It's no wonder that so many superstitions clung to the Silk Road. When your livelihood depended on the whims of weather, a lucky charm felt just as important as a full water skin. And finally, let's drift into memory. The Silk Road has become more than history, it's a metaphor for connection, for globalization, for the idea that humanity is one tangled web. It shows up in politics, in tourism, in literature. Every time someone says New Silk Road, they're not really talking about camels, they're invoking the dream of a world stitched together by trade and ideas. Of course, the reality was harsher. It was slow, dangerous, and mostly for the benefit of elites. But bedtime stories aren't about reality. They're about comfort. And the comfort here is the thought that even in ancient times, people reached across borders, tried to connect, tried to share. That's why the Silk Road lingers, not as a road, but as a dream. So here we are, drifting at the end of yet another leg. The caravan is gone, the market stalls are empty, the wind is sweeping across the desert. All that's left are echoes, the faint taste of spice, the shimmer of silk, the soft whisper of stories told in the glow of a caravanserai fire. And with that, dear listener, the Silk Road story can finally rest. Good night.